Good morning, everyone. You guys okay? You can hear us? You're, okay, thank you. Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to the sixth public hearing that we're having for the Special Education Funding Commission that was created under House Bill 2. We're here in State College today, so we want to thank everybody. Today we have, we're going to be dealing today with the charter and cyber charter schools and how funding is affected with them concerning special education funding for their special ed students. Before we move on, I'll turn it over to my co-chair here, Senator Brown, to say a few words, and then we'll have the members that are here introduce themselves. And as time goes on, we'll probably have more members come in, and so we'll introduce them at that time.
Thank you. Just briefly, I just wanted to thank State College, the university, for hosting us today. We've tried to be, in scheduling, try to make sure that the commission is comprehensive both in its willingness to include all interests across the state and to make sure that we're comprehensive in gathering the information that's necessary to build a formula that includes all parties. And in passing Act 3 of 2013, there was a component of it that requires the commission to include an analysis and recommendations regarding special education funding, not only for the traditional bricks and mortar institutions, but also charter and cyber charter schools. And that's necessary to make sure that when we put forward our recommendations that the formula that we do is relevant to all parties in the Commonwealth. If that was not part of our discussion, I believe given the increasing significance of charter and cyber charter institutions in educating our young people, our recommendations and our corresponding formula would not be complete. So I wanted to thank everyone for participating today. It's been tremendous the level of response we've gotten as we've moved across the state, and I think that just shows the interest in the issue. So thank you for everyone for being here, and I will turn it back to my co-chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We'll have the members starting down at the right there to introduce themselves that are here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carolyn Demarais. I'm the Acting Secretary of Education.
Good morning. Mark Longetti, State Representative from Mercer County. It's good to be here in State College. I'm proud to have a Penn State branch, Penn State Shenango, in my district.
Mike Sterla, State Representative from Lancaster.
Good morning, Mike Pfeiffer. I represent the 139th House District, which is Pike, Wayne, and Monroe counties.
Thank you. And I forgot to introduce myself in the beginning. I'm Representative Bernie O'Neill, and I represent the 29th District, which is the center of Bucks County. Before we begin and have our first presenters come before us, I would just like to ask everybody, in the interest of time and in the interest of what our charge as a committee is, that you stay on task and we talk about special ed funding and how it impacts your schools, how it impacts your students, because that's what we're dealing with, and we need to stay on that task. Unfortunately, our last meeting, we kind of did a little bird walking and got off from that, and put us about an hour behind schedule. Schedule is very important to us because we're traveling and we have some meetings afterwards, and so we have to stay on schedule. And with all due respect to everyone involved in our previous hearings and this hearing and future hearings, we know that everybody is in love with their programs and in love with their issues, and but unfortunately, we are tasked with just dealing with the funding at this time. So if you start bird walking and kind of start talking about something that really doesn't have to do with what our charge is as a committee, then I'm going to have to cut you off a little so that we can stay on task. So with that, we'd like to begin with our first presenters, and that's Lawrence Jones, Larry Sperling, and Reese. Do you go by Reese, or is it Maurice? Reese? Flory. Did I pronounce it right? Flory? If you'll come up, and if what you'll do is all of you introduce yourselves, and who you represent, and then you can begin in any order that you would like.
My name is Lawrence Jones. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Richard Allen Preparatory Charter School and one of its founders. I also serve as the President of the Pennsylvania Coalition for Public Charter Schools.
I am Maurice Flory. I am the CEO of Commonwealth Connections Academy Cyber Charter School.
Larry Sperling, CEO, Philadelphia Academy Charter School.
Before you go in, maybe you can tell us where your schools are located. You're Philadelphia, so, yeah, right.
We're in the northeast section of Philadelphia.
Yeah, you're right on Woodhaven Road?
No, that's Mast.
Oh, that's Mass.
We're by Red Lion and Byberry,
Byberry.
and behind Chickies and Pete's.
Pete's,
the
okay, I
boulevard.
know
We have
exactly
two
where you are.
locations.
Southwest Philadelphia. We're at 58th and Lindbergh, near Bartram's Garden.
Oh, okay.
Of course, being a cyber charter school, we're statewide, but we currently have 8 teaching centers, 2 in Harrisburg, Cranberry Township north of Pittsburgh, Williamsport, Dixon City, Scranton Region, Williamsport, and then 2 in Philadelphia.
And where would your main administration department be?
Main administrative offices are in Harrisburg.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I go by Larry also, but I'll go by Lawrence today so as not to, we look so similar. I want to first thank you all for undertaking this very serious and important topic. And I do understand, I think we all understand, it's a very difficult and challenging and complicated topic. I thank you for asking me to appear before you today on a very important, complicated subject, and I applaud your efforts to bring equity and fairness to special education funding. In addition, as I mentioned, to being the CEO of the Richard Allen Preparatory Charter School, I am the president of the Pennsylvania Coalition for Public Charter Schools. And that role over the years has given me the opportunity to visit many charter schools, both brick and mortar and cyber. It's also given me the opportunity to hear from operators, parents, legislators, and other stakeholders related to some of the good things that are happening with charter schools and some of the concerns. A lot of those do deal with funding. Let me start with a very fundamental premise, and that is that a special needs child is a special needs child. It doesn't matter where that child chooses to go to school or where his or her parents choose to send them to school. They should receive the same scope and quality of education. They should receive the same ability for funding that any child receives. At the state level, we were supportive of this legislation from the beginning because it is designed to look at the needs of the children and is blind to which district they live in or whether they go to a traditional cyber or brick and mortar public school. Puts the needs of children first, and any legislation which does that we support. Unfortunately, the current state is not consistent with my fundamental premise. Throughout this state, some educators and parents have been alleged to be gaming the system to try to move special education students to their schools or out of their schools, or to change their classification to best suit either the needs of the parents, the child, or the school. As someone, and I'm going to stray for a moment, as someone who has a history of a teacher, as a teacher, I taught in the school district of Philadelphia for several years. As an individual who is a person of color, an African American, I know that for many times in that community, in our community, special education designation was always looked at sometimes with kind of an evil eye, because there was a lot of misidentification, over-identification. So I'm very sensitive to that beyond just the funding reasons. But recently, we've seen some attempts to game the system based on funding, based on oftentimes, from a parental point of view, parents trying to get what they deem is best for their children, and sometimes they see the special education avenue is able to get them additional resources or the resources they need. From a school point of view, any time that a child would be misclassified, overclassified, underclassified for financial benefit or for expedience, we find that to be in direct violation of free and appropriate public education. It's unethical and it's shameful. We do not and cannot support that. From a charter perspective, funding and support for special education that should come from the IUs is strong in some areas. It's non-existent in other areas. This is a huge problem and creates some of the angst that we see with funding. Many IUs reflect the attitude of their traditional school base and view charters as an unwanted stepchild, not worthy of support, not only in special education, but in all areas. Moreover, charter schools with extensive special education populations have significant transportation costs that are not funded by money passed through from the districts. Another concern is that for charter schools, any major funding change executed in isolation can have a disastrous result. Consider the funding for the school where I'm employed. This past year, our school served 51 special education students, and I do have an updated version of this. My initial numbers were incorrect. We've received approximately $630,000 in special education funding, but we actually spent close to $650,000. And when we look at that, that's just for our students who have an IEP. There are other services that deal with other students who may have a 504 accommodation. These services, for either of the students, I have not included things like various supplies, training, adaptive programs, additional administrative costs. I haven't included things like some of our counseling and special programs, and then some of the creative things that as a smaller charter school, we've had to put in place, not only because we were mandated to do so, but because we have found that adding these things helps students with disabilities, but it also helps our entire school population. It helps not only with creative programming, but it also helps individuals understand that we're all a little bit different. We all have our own forms of disabilities, our challenges and strengths, and by making sure that we can work together and having appropriate programs that address student needs, we actually teach our children a very important lesson. The majority of our children in our school are also coming from an urban setting. We range from 82 to 92% poverty level. Our school's very unique in certain ways. So when we look at special education funding and any type of funding, it's very important that when you consider charter schools, if we try to put them in one box, even in the city of Philadelphia, it's different. You'll hear from Mr. Sperling. His school population and his school numbers are completely different from my school. What works for his school can't work for my school, just based on numbers. So I'm very much in tune with the need for special education funding reform, but I don't think that we can have this conversation without having the conversation and understanding that we've had discussions about overall charter school funding reform. So as the CEO of a small charter school, I want to get what's fair for every one of my students. And if a new funding formula for special education results in an overall loss, I don't know that a small school like ours can provide the same services to students with disabilities or to students without disabilities. And on a personal and professional level, on a humanistic level, to me, that's scary. It's frightening. So I urge you to consider the following recommendations as part of your report: that any special education funding changes for charter schools not be done in isolation. We've encouraged to have a commission like this that looks at all charter school funding. That any special education funding changes be done in a manner to ensure that all children with disabilities are treated equally and with respect. Funding tiers and delineations should not serve to create second or third classes of special education students depending upon their disability, district of residence, or their parents' decision to pursue a public charter option. Because I go to a charter school or because I don't go to a charter school, if I have a disability, I shouldn't be treated any differently. I mean, that's the whole point of what we do for special education and for education in general. Thirdly, intermediate units should be made to provide services and access to services in a manner consistent with that provided to district. You know, in Philadelphia, I'll tell you right now, for special education services, most charter schools do not go to the Philadelphia IU. You might go to Chester County IU, you might go to Montgomery County IU, but for Philadelphia IU, that's non-existent for us. As a support, as a service provider, that has never, in my 12 years, existed for me. It's never been an option. And that's wrong. You know, perhaps the final thing I would say is we may want to look outside of the box here. One of the things that's been thrown out as an idea is perhaps having an IU of just charter schools, a statewide IU. What does that look like? What does it look like if we have an IU that actually provides services and can actually be very sensitive, not only in funding, but in providing services to the challenges, to the differences, to the needs specific to charter schools? In your opening statements, I believe, Senator Brown, you mentioned that charter schools have become institutions of learning in Pennsylvania. Over 110,000 students, close to, I think, 115,000 students are going to be enrolled in charter schools this year. In Philadelphia alone, we are almost 3 times the size of what would be the second largest school district in the Commonwealth. How we fund our students in both regular and special education can either be a crowning glory for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or a lasting shame. As someone who has worked in education for 20 years, I would love to be attached to something that's wonderful for children. And I would hate to have my reputation, the reputation of this Commonwealth, be besmirched by our failures to provide students, especially students with disability, with equal funding. I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for having me also, and thank you for this important task, as Larry said. I've been involved in public education for over 38 years. I began as a teacher in Philadelphia for 15 years. I beg your pardon? Strawberry Mansion, junior, senior high. Oh, okay. I was a teacher for 15 years, a school principal, and a central level administrator that was involved in allocating dollars to schools, both for regular education and special education. We had a tiered system that we used. I'm going to talk about that. What I have to say to you today is on a bit of a lower level than my colleague was speaking about. I'm going to talk more about the practical applications of how the school district did special education funding over 7 years ago. I spent 30 years in Philly. I've been in the charter school for 8 years now. I don't know how they're doing it now. Things have changed a lot since I've left. I was responsible, as I said, for allocating the dollars based on real numbers. The school district received money for special education. Then they took the money centrally and doled it out based on needs to each school. You'll hear me speak over the next couple minutes about high incidence and low incidence. And just for clarity, when we talked about that in the school district, when we referred to high incidence, it meant many kids. So high incidence basically was speech, language, included learning disabilities. Then we spoke about low incidence, not meaning low needs, just there were not as many children in low incidence as high incidence, and there we're talking about low functioning autism, ID, multiple handicaps. The way the school district funded, dollars went directly to the schools for high incidence. Resources for low incidence remained centrally, and as a result of economy of scale, not every school would have an autistic self-contained program because there were not enough kids in each school. They would locate them centrally. They had the ability to do that, and they were able to transport the students. As a result, dollars were allocated based on the kids' needs for language, speech, inclusion. Those that spent more than 50% of their time in a self-contained special education situation were given resources at the school centrally, and kids were carted in essentially from various locations. So that if there were needs above and beyond what were normal, for example, a kid might need a personal care assistant, that was allocated centrally and did not impact on the school's budget. That being said, I spent a number of years doing that, and in making the jump to Philadelphia Academy Charter School 8 years ago and becoming the CEO 5 years ago, we're kind of a unique school in Philadelphia. We're 1,185 students. Of those, we have a 25% special needs population. Of that, 6% of our overall population are considered low-incidence students. That's approximately 38% of our entire special ed population. We have approximately 260 students that have a need, some need. Maybe 20 of them are only speech. But we probably have well over 100 kids that do receive speech services, because of the 60 or so autistic children, almost all of them would need speech services. All that being said, we now receive a flat rate at the charter school for every special education student. This year alone, coming into the 2013-2014 school year, a few of these IEPs have been inherited by incoming ninth graders that were created at their old schools. We were going to need 5 personal care assistants and 1 what is known as a C-print specialist that we're contracting with Bucks County IU for. 10 children above and beyond their classroom placement at our school are costing us $360,000 this year that is unfunded from special education. We're toughing it out, and we always do this, but that's where the rub comes for us for such a high number of low-incidence students, students with large needs. Additionally, at Philadelphia Academy, we run a pretty comprehensive school-to-work transition program for students 18 to 21. We take them into the community, they do volunteer work. We have to devote a number of staff members and a number of transportation vehicles to carting our students around to their job sites for those 3 years. All these are expenses that are above and beyond what we would receive for their classroom placement. This year we had our, just to give you an idea, we had our Bureau of Special Education, the BSE audit, that happens once every 6 years. We were commended in 7 areas for the fine work we do with special education, and of the hundreds of items that you could have for corrective action, we were not cited for 1 single item needing corrective action. This is after extensive interviews with parents, staff, observations of the student life. For us, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because what's happening now is, and my friend Larry can tell you this, we have a reputation in Philadelphia as the place where you should send your children if they have severe needs. Consequently, the applications we get for our lottery, lots and lots of applications for students who have IEPs, because we're known as doing a fine job with those students. We get 2,500 applications a year. We have maybe 100 openings. Of those 2,500 applications, I don't know how many have IEPs, but this year, of everybody that we accepted, about 30% of the students that came in through the lottery do have an IEP that comes with them. 3 of those students, their IEP requires they have a personal care assistant. A personal care assistant for us, as I mentioned, is a large burden. If you talk about salary, benefits, PSERS, Social Security, our costs for a personal care assistant are about $32,000, if you include all the costs, as I said. And I'm not even including those students that do not have IEPs that do require 504 plans. So that's not even part of my conversation now. The IU in Philadelphia, as Larry said also, really does not do much. They require us to submit data in order to release our IDEA funds. We have to submit invoices, and that's about the extent of what the IU in Philadelphia does. Now, the funding system as it currently exists causes a particular problem at Philadelphia Academy, where the cost of necessary support services for many of the most severely challenged children is often 3 times the allotted dollars. I'm certain this is true for every school that serves large numbers of low-incidence students. A tiered system that does not take into account, and I'm all for a tiered system, but if it does not take into account the additional expenses, as I said, of occupational therapy, physical therapy, personal care assistance, speech and language for those kids that have multiple disabilities, then that will cause a hardship for us. That's the point I'm trying to get across, is In Philly, we had a fairly good system for allocating based on needs, but there was a supervisory system in place that ensured there was not over-identification and that the gaming did not happen for the most part. It kind of worked. If that's going to be the case, that's critical, that over-identification does not happen. And while I can't say to you here, I have a solution for how to do this, I was called in and asked to do this recently. I believe there is a solution here, although I couldn't say to you what it is today. I assume that that's what the commission is looking at. And that's what I have to say about my experience with special ed, how we handle special ed at Philadelphia Academy, and as I said, the double-edged sword of more and more children applying there. I'll wrap up with Larry, myself, other charter CEOs have spoken over the years about developing an IU system for the charter schools in Philadelphia. I never considered it statewide. We often have special ed supervisors and teachers come to us and spend a day or two with us, with our teachers, with our support staff in special education to see how we do it. It's got to be burdensome for a school that if you choose a student from the lottery that has a very low functioning students with a lot of needs and you do not have that program now, how do you do that program at a smaller charter school? Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning. I'd also like to thank the members of the commission for this opportunity. Again, as stated earlier, my name is Reese Fleury. I'm the CEO of Commonwealth Connections Academy. CCA is a statewide cyber charter school. My background previous to coming in at CCA is I had 25 years in traditional public schools, anywhere from teacher, assistant principal, principal, and assistant superintendent. Unlike my colleagues here at the table, most of my experiences were in central Pennsylvania, from suburban, fairly affluent suburban school districts to very underfunded and financially challenged rural school districts around the central Pennsylvania area. As stated earlier, CCA is one of the larger cyber charter schools in Pennsylvania. I believe right now we're about third largest. If we were a school district, we would be larger than 412 school districts within the Commonwealth if we were a standalone school district. This year we'll serve about 8,000 students residing in 479 of the 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. This requires us to work with special education service providers statewide, which is kind of a unique prospect, where if you're regionally bound, you have a tendency to work with one IU or a closed group of providers. We have to work statewide, obviously. Interestingly enough, because we are a statewide cyber charter, our student demographic almost exactly mirrors that of the Commonwealth in many respects. Our graduation rate is about the same as the state average. We graduate 85% of our students. About 50% of our students are free and reduced meal eligible, and 17% of our students have special education needs, and that's IEP. Again, that also does not include 504 students. About 1 to 2% of our students have 504. Some type of physical accommodation is required. Despite these large numbers, we maintain 100% certified, Pennsylvania certified staff. 44 of those staff are dedicated just to special education services. 66 total staff are dedicated to special ed, some type of the aides and support staff that are required. Our overall student-teacher ratio is 23-1, and again, mentioned earlier, we have 8 teaching centers across the Commonwealth, and just to maintain those facilities is about $2.9 million expense, just to maintain those physical facilities. I'm going to go through briefly just to talk some real general financial numbers in the cyber charter world, because it helps to give us a little bit of a foundation as we talk about some special education numbers. It's important to understand that when we look at cyber education, oftentimes costs are not necessarily less, they're just different. Different needs, different delivery models, so we see unique expenses. For example, to develop a single online course costs around $40,000 in our environment. Right now we offer 281 courses at CCA. That alone, just in curriculum development, is a little over $11 million expense. And this doesn't include the 25 supplemental virtual programs we use to support students that need additional supports besides regular curriculum content. We're also required as part of a charter, as a cyber charter school, to provide and ship textbooks, computers, ink cartridges, and all the materials to support our program. That's a cost of about $15 million annually, just to provide the necessary materials to students. In addition, as part of the charter, we have to reimburse for internet subsidy, for the families. That's about $2 million per year. One of the very unique and recent undertakings in cyber education that's extremely expensive is PSSA and Keystone testing requirements. To comply with the state testing requirement, we have to rent space in 60 facilities across the state. In addition to securing the hotels, transportation, accommodations for our staff, just so we can have physical proctors for each of our students. The planning and execution of just state testing last year cost in excess of $700,000 for our school. And this doesn't include modifications for special education students or extra staff and resources for students that required specific and special testing accommodations. We'll talk about the alternative assessment system for special education students a little bit later. Some of the things that are also removed, from the standard funding formula, not to get on, regular funding, is about the transportation. Well, we're not transporting students to these testing sites and the physical facilities to have adequate supervision. Obviously, we have to transport staff at a significant cost. That's an overview of just some baseline costs for regular. Let's get into specifics of special education. Obviously, special education students require special equipment, special staffing, and special concerns. 17% of our students are special need. Our average funding per special education student is around $16,000. You'll see that number different depending on the educational entity. Obviously, for these gentlemen, Philadelphia, it's different because they deal just with the Philadelphia funding. We're dealing with 500 different funding formulas for special education across the Commonwealth. So every district's contribution for a special education district is different, just like the regular education contribution is different. If you combine regular ed and special ed, that's 1,000 different rates across the Commonwealth for educational services. But our average is about $16,000 per special education student. In many cases, students in this category and the costs associated far exceed the funding from the school districts, which in many times has led those students to actually be referred from the district of residence. We can't deny enrollment. As a statewide cyber charter, we can't deny a student enrollment if we think it would be too difficult or a challenge for us to provide services. I listed 5 specific examples. These are individual students, obviously I didn't put name or the district that sent them, that shows their individual costs in excess of funding. Again, these are students that the average cost is about $16,000, and this is annual cost, and this, in parentheses, the students provided to each of these 5 students, with a high of $87,000 and the 5th student listed $57,400 for these services. And again, this is an annual number per student. In addition, some of these students have very intensive needs that have to be contracted to other providers. These services come at astronomical costs. You'll notice in attachment A that is included in your handout. It's just a sample list of costs and services from private providers as well as intermediate units. We have over 100 different providers that we have to contract with for special education services across the Commonwealth. And some of the discussions have been about IUs providing these services. While IUs have the capability to provide these services, we've been very successful with some IUs, have a wonderful working relationship with them providing services to our children, even use of facilities at times for us. Not so with other intermediate units. They've absolutely refused to even enter into discussions concerning services to our special education populations. Also, the cost of services at some of these IUs greatly exceeds services that can be purchased from a private provider. In many cases, like CCA as a cyber charter school, even brick and mortar traditional school districts have chose to go to private entities simply because the IUs have priced themselves out of business for some of these services. It's just simply too expensive to use the IU programming. CCL has a large number of students that require an alternative assessment for state purposes. By code, there's students that are permitted to what's called, able to take the PASA, P-A-S-A, which is different than the standard Pennsylvania assessment. 1% of your student population is allowed to take the alternative assessment. We slightly exceeded that in CCA this year, simply because we had a few students that it was going to be such an educational challenge that we were worried about what the emotional toll it may have taken on some of these students to go through an exam that they were absolutely ill-equipped to be able to take because of significant disabilities the students may have. This takes significant effort. In a traditional school district, when you deliver the alternate assessment, it needs to be videotaped, and 1 or 2 staff members need to do this assessment with the student. The videotape of that assessment is then delivered to the Department of Ed for review. In a cyber charter world, we're under that same requirement. That means we have to send 2 staff members either to a third-party location or to that child's home to administer that assessment. And generally, that's a 2-day enterprise. At least 1 day for travel, 1 to 2 days to deliver the assessment, and a day to travel back. So it can be 2 to 4 days in travel. Because it needs to be done one-on-one, videotaped, and then that then needs to be uploaded to the department. Just the technology starts to be expensive. To have that many video systems and upload systems to store to be able to distribute to the department becomes cost prohibitive. We estimated this year, just to test our students, just our students that required the alternate assessment, it was around $23,000 just for that small sampling of students. And that's only 70 kids. It took 22 full-time staff just to deliver the assessment to 70 students. So it becomes very time intensive. And these teachers obviously have other educational responsibilities beyond just these testing requirements. As you've heard from testimony in each of the previous hearings, from PASBO, from the IU representative, this is a critical time in special ed for traditional and non-traditional sectors. You might be surprised to hear that we agree with a lot of their testimony. We echo a large amount of what other school officials have in front of them, and we face many of these same issues. We agree that special education subsidies have flatlined over the past several years, and any school district official will tell you their costs have not. Many times in regular ed, as a school leader, you can have some cost containment and controls. In special education, oftentimes you're at the mercy of your clientele. These students deserve the services that are appropriate for them based on their disability. Where the contention comes in is discussion of what is appropriate. But in any regard, there's no way that you can deem the costs associated as decreasing in recent times. At the date of this hearing, one of the challenges we face in special education and overall as an operator of a cyber charter school, at the time of this hearing, we still have $11 million in funding due to us from students we educated last year that we have not received from the district of residence. That becomes a huge challenge for us operationally to start this school year and be able to provide services to our students. Not much can be done to reduce the costs associated with special ed. It's a challenge for cyber charters, traditional schools. The additional resources required challenge all of us. Some of the most exponentially increasing costs are those required for private placements. Increasing numbers of special education students populations are also shifting from lower cost disabilities like speech and language to much higher cost disabilities such as autism support. Parents of special education students have told us that they decided to send their child to CCA for a myriad of reasons. A lot of people think special education, why would you choose a cyber charter school? For many of these, it's because just of a general dissatisfaction with the services, and oftentimes they express a lack of compassion provided from their previous school. Others selected CCA to protect their child from bullying. As we know, children with special needs can sometimes be looked at as different from their colleagues in their traditional school or from their other students. Many make this choice because their kids are simply stuck in the IEP evaluation process. Just during this last school year, 18% of the students that newly enrolled with us were already out of compliance the day they came to us, which means testing timelines, evaluation timelines, they're already in arrears, which means educational programming had not been providing to that student. So sometimes you hear about the over-identification of students in cyber charters or charter schools. Oftentimes it's because that evaluation process was stuck and not done in a timely manner. When they come to us, we finally bring the testing protocols and the special education timelines to resolution. At CCA, we strive to fully comply with the law in that IEP with the identification of children. Oftentimes, we were very successful of children being discharged from services. Just because the nature of our environment, sometimes students that required an IEP in a traditional setting, we were able to remove from special education services just because of the nature of our program delivery. It's a small number, but every year we have students that we're able to remove that IEP label from because they choose an online environment. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I hope the information I provided helps give you a little bit of facts and figures and some background to make the challenging decisions you have in front of you. Thank you for conducting these hearings, because special education is a challenge for all of us in the education field. And I'll entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm sure some of us have questions. I just have a few. You spoke about the IU. I know the two of you are based in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia school system. Are all your students from the Philadelphia school system?
The majority of my students are from the Philadelphia School District. Occasionally, we may have a student who comes to our school, and then if their family moves right outside of the city, they elect to stay with our school. So I would say, I think my number this year out of 500 students is maybe 10, 11.
Okay. And I guess my question to you is, how can you do work with the IUs outside of the Philadelphia School District?
Simply we needed a particular service this year. I mentioned the C-print captionist for a hard of hearing student.
Oh, so you can just contract
Yes.
with them?
Yeah,
You don't have to?
so it
Oh,
was
I
a
see.
flat-out contract with the Bucks County IU.
Okay,
Is who we did.
I see.
And don't get us wrong, there are meetings that are held regularly by the school district, but for the vast majority, if I have a question or my special ed coordinator has a question about special education,
But I guess my point is then, the Centennial School District, which is in Bucks County, could contract with the Montgomery County IU for a service if they needed to then.
I assume they could, but the Bucks County IU is not a bad IU, except, as our other colleagues stated, the pricing factor.
Right.
We didn't have many options on this C-print captionist.
How are you funded by the school districts for your special ed students? Do you send them a bill based on services? How does that all work?
Philadelphia in general is a little bit different. So we have the special education rate in Philadelphia. We have the regular education rate in Philadelphia. Every child who's enrolled in a charter school in Philadelphia is enrolled through what's called the school computer network. So the way our billing procedure works is we enroll a child in the school computer network. The child has an IEP. The IEP, the evaluation dates, all of those dates, critical dates, are placed into that school computer network. If those dates are valid, they're in compliance, then the monthly payment, special education and regular education, is sent to the school. If one of those dates is out of compliance, then we only receive the regular education rate for that month for the student, or until the compliance comes up to speed. In terms of IDEA funding, that funding, as Larry mentioned, we get, it's per pupil, and it comes to the school, and there is an invoicing where you say what you spent the money on, and you receive it.
And that's the same as the public.
Actually, real quick, on the
Traditional public schools.
on the IDEA, which is the federal funds for
Right.
special ed, the IU gets the money, gives us an allocation, we budget for that money, then we have to invoice. For the 12-13 school year, which ended June 30th, I think we began receiving our IDEA payments sometime in May of that year, where we should have gotten them July 1st. We didn't get them until May, which is a whole nother topic, because then that becomes a burden on a smaller charter where they just can't afford to foot that bill until the money comes in. But essentially, we invoice them for the services. In our case, we just charge employees. We don't charge contracted services, things of that nature.
Gotcha.
And that's how we're reimbursed.
Are the cyber schools under the same formula for the school districts paying for special ed services?
No, our formula, each district has a regular ed rate and a special education rate.
Right.
And if that student comes from that district and they're a special education student, regardless of the services provided, there's one flat number for special education students from that district.
And how's that formula created? I guess that's my,
It's a adaptation of the 363 based on regular ed.
okay. And my last question, because I know other people have questions. You spoke about private placement with
Correct.
special education. What is a private placement with a cyber school?
Sometimes students with severe disabilities, you simply, and the same thing in a traditional school or with these gentlemen in a brick and mortar charter school, you can't deliver appropriate program. You can't deliver FAPE in your environment. And so to do that, oftentimes it requires a 24-hour facility. It requires a private entity that delivers those educational service, and then it's just a fee-for-service arrangement. One that's very well known in central Pennsylvania is the Vista School for Autism Support. It's about $40-some thousand per year. They run all educational programming. The school entity simply pays that bill to the Vista School to deliver the programming. We have several private entities like that we have to deal with because we can't deliver FAPE in our cyber charter environment.
Then I guess my question is, why isn't that being determined and being done by the home sending school? If you can't provide the service for that student, why would you enroll that student?
We have no choice. So we cannot deny enrollment based on a student's educational need by Pennsylvania charter law. Other states, that is a provision. The charter school and the local school district have to work in agreement if they can deliver FAPE in the environment, not in Pennsylvania. And that's what I mentioned in the testimony. It's becoming a little bit of an insidious practice at certain school entities where they look at it simply from an economic basis. If I have an autistic student and my special education rate is $20,000 per year and I know that private placement is going to cost me $40,000, they often recommend to the parent to enroll the child in a cyber charter school because then they have a cost containment for that special education service.
Gotcha.
In our case, In our case, we run a lottery. Parent applies for whatever reason, and we pick up a kid, and it's very rare that we've had to do private placements because we do have a pretty comprehensive program. But over the years, we've had 2 or 3 of them, and again, it's, as my colleague said, we can't provide FAPE there. But we've picked the kid up by a lottery. Often as it is $50,000 to $60,000 for that private placement per year.
Great, thank you. Senator Brown. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Just want to get a little more detail regarding reimbursements. So purposes of the people viewing this as well, so there's a better understanding. You have a standard reimbursement rate and an adjusted rate for special ed, and that seems to be, I'm sure it varies statewide, but it seems to be the general protocol. Now,
Correct.
Philadelphia, within the current non-charter, non-cyber charter environment, Larry, you mentioned that they reimburse directly to the school, and those reimbursements for special ed differ based on the need of the school. Now, is that a pure cost reimbursement for that school?
Well, let me clarify.
We're trying to
Let me clarify.
parallel the Philadelphia, because what we have to do as part of our charge is adjust rates. We have to adjust based on need. I'd like to know if Philadelphia does that.
There's a number of funding streams that come into the school. Your basic subsidy.
Okay.
Your basic subsidy from Philadelphia to the charter school is a flat rate for regular education students, a flat rate for special education students.
Okay.
In addition to the basic subsidy, we receive Title I money, we receive Title IIA money, we also receive IDEA money. IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, dollars are provided federally. So that's a supplemental source of income to meet the needs of your special ed population. That's what's controlled by the intermediary unit, or IU-26 in Philadelphia. So as this Larry mentioned, with the school computer network and the identification of students, we're given a monthly rate for the appropriate regular education and special education. But over the course of the year, we invoice for our IDEA dollars. So there are 2 different sources, so to speak. That being said, I don't know, does that help at all?
How is, just get a little more detail regarding the differential between, and how it's done, between a regular reimbursement, basic ed, and the adjustment done on a special ed scenario, is it done just flat if you have a special education, a student that has an IEP, or is there, in some cases, more or less based on the type of services to the student?
Not at this time.
At the
It's-
local level, that doesn't exist
No.
anywhere.
And excuse me, this question was not to me, but Senator, for clarity, I think, was your question related to how the school district of Philadelphia provides funding to its own schools for special education?
Well, that would be helpful as well, because I
Okay.
think
Well,
you had mentioned that there is, at least in terms of direct school reimbursement within the Philadelphia model.
Okay.
That's one model. There is an adjustment done to a school based on relative need. Like if a school has a low-need student, primarily, they will reimburse less for that than they would for a high.
that's
need
exactly right, and that was the practice, as far as I know, up until about 7 years ago.
Okay.
I don't know what the practice is at this point. I have heard, we just hired a new special ed supervisor who came from Philadelphia, and I was speaking, 2 weeks ago, we brought her on board. And I mentioned, how is it done now? And it's not done that way anymore. So they kind of have a more supervisor-based, needs assessment-based for allocating it. They no longer allocate dollars to the schools. They allocate it through a central level of examining what the needs are and providing the services centrally.
Okay.
Does that kind
Yes,
of make sense?
yes.
It used to be, though, based on the needs. So if you had a population of kids who had only speech therapy, small amount. If you had a population of kids that had inclusion needs, larger amount. Inclusion meaning special needs kids who are mainstreamed for the most part into regular ed classrooms. There'd be a little bit more. Then when you got to the low incidence students, meaning small numbers but high needs, at that time they were also controlled centrally, almost as if it were an IU. So from a top level, they'd say, all right, we'll have an autism program here, we'll have a MDD program here, and that was how the funding was done. But as I said, this was up until 7 years ago, and I thought it was a pretty good basis for allocating based on needs.
Well, it's what we are trying to
Yeah,
accomplish
that-
here.
Yeah, that's
And
what I was talking about.
maybe it came down to administrative, it was easier to do administratively the new way, or maybe funding, I don't know. But it seems that what they were doing originally, in adjusting based on need, is to serve this, as you had mentioned, Larry, to serve the student in their needs made sense. So that's something I'd like to take a further look at how they did that and whether it's relevant to what we're doing now, because it seems that what they were doing in the past is what we're
I
trying to do here.
believe it was relevant and is relevant to what you're looking at.
Okay.
but
Well, you were concerned, and it's, in response to some of the testimony, you were concerned about what we do with our formula and how we structure it, whether it will be punitive to a LEA, and that's, we wouldn't be meeting our charge if that was the case, and there's a goal not to do that. And as far as the data collection, we were making sure that this is not a process that is overly burdensome to our school districts and is seen as a partnership with the state in trying to improve what we're doing. So just to respond to some of the initial comments in terms of our goals here. But the concern we have is, one of the concerns we had is there any history in Pennsylvania in reimbursing for services that reflect on the needs of students? And it seems what we're hearing is it's just the same as what the state's doing now, and that's just a flat reimbursement and adjustment from a base that's happening. That's the case in the cyber as well, the cyber systems as well? Is there any school districts that serve, that are the resident districts for your student, that do that type of adjustment, or is it just a flat rate as well?
It's a flat rate, and what's curious is the flat rate is often driven off as a calculator of their regular ed rate. And so it doesn't even take into account the individual needs of the special education students from their district as a whole. It's just based on a multiplier of the regular education rate.
Do you have any idea how the multiplier is set?
It's just about 80% to double, depending on the district, their regular ed rate. Depending on and it's different district to district. There's 500 different rates and 500 different percentages based on the regular ed rate.
It's just an estimate, I guess.
It's just an estimate. Yeah, so an individual district may send a whole group of students that are just speech and language, that only have minimal costs over the regular education rate, where another district may send kids with severe needs. That's not going to adversely or positively affect their rate and reimbursement to the cyber charter school.
And lastly, one of the challenges we have in building a formula is trying to accommodate the different, not only the needs of the students, but the service protocols that they are given, both in location and in, I guess, the setting, is best in transportation. We're charged with taking different needs of students and adjusting reimbursements up based on those needs. And one of our challenges is going to be, is that equally as relevant in a bricks and mortar institution as opposed to a cyber institution? Like if we had hypothetically, a high need student, and we set a multiplier for that high need student above the base rate of 30% higher or 40% higher in order to reimburse through a formula, would that accurately reflect the services of that student within a cyber environment as opposed to a brick and mortar environment? And what do we need to consider as far as the differences? That's a very important piece to make sure that when we put out our recommendations, that all of you are comfortable with what we're doing, that we're considering your method and means of providing educational services for students. And I'm very interested in hearing what we would need to consider to make sure that those factors are properly considered.
Well, for a cyber charter world, it's very similar to the brick and mortar world, and we need some type of equitable source of funding based on the services needed to be provided to that child. Right now, it's blind to that. And it's blind to the school districts on the type of students they're sending. And so the same way our traditional school district brethren are saying we want it to more reflect what we have to spend on special ed, we would certainly support legislation that would do the same thing. So some type of a tiered system that would take into account not just the number of students you're serving, but the severity of those students we think would be appropriate.
But do we have to, for a student with a certain level of need, student is in a brick and mortar institution, hypothetically, goes to a cyber institution, and in a formula that reflects that need, does now that student in a properly structured state formula have to be, does that component of the formula have to be adjusted a bit in order to accommodate the cyber environment?
Well, and that becomes a real monumental challenge because depending on the disability, it may be more expensive to deliver that service in a cyber charter world, or another service it may be more cost effective to deliver in an online environment. So if we start looking at an adjustment based on individual service to the child, that's a monumental task for the commission. I mean, I would applaud the ability to do that, but I think that is such a level of detail, it would be a tremendous challenge because literally you'd almost have to go by disability to disability to see what the most cost-effective solutions would be for program delivery and service delivery.
But there's no generic difference in consideration of the different settings that the child's being served that needs to be considered for that student in, say, a higher category?
Oh, certainly. There would be some commonalities, just similar to like what's driven out by the Penn data where you have tiers that in general it's going to cost this much for this range of students. I certainly think you could do the same type of thing in the cyber charters. Yep.
Okay. Well, that's very important. I'm only bringing this, I guess this is more of an opening dialogue as to what the expectations are.
And
'Cause-
I'm
go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
And then I was only going to say, and then somehow deal with the expenditures for the really severely needed. Every year we do a data collection for the state. It's due, I think, December 31st, of your special needs population, how many cost between 10 and 20,000, how many between 20 and 50,000,
Yes.
50 to 75, and in
Right.
excess of 75. Now, they're not asking us for the details and the students and that. They're just asking us for raw numbers. So someone somewhere has an interest in what you're doing with that. We have twin brothers in our school, both in 9th grade this year, together with their transportation needs, their personal care assistants, are costing us $170,000 for the 2 students, and additionally, they have TSS workers that we don't pay for that are provided by the state. So these are large burdens of expenditures. Now, you're going to get the students that do have severe needs that will need maybe a little with the range you're speaking about where it would work. But there, I'm assuming in our situation anyway, there will be extreme needs, not for a lot, but there are.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Sterling.
Thanks. So I want to follow up a little bit on the questioning thus far. So what I'm hearing is that if I'm a school district right now that has lots of students with low needs, you know, maybe speech therapy, a little something like that, and I've got a few students with high needs, my overall costs are actually fairly low, and so my reimbursement rate to the charters or cyber charters is less, because that's how my formula is driven, to charters and cyber charters, than if I've got a lot of high need students and a few low need students. Is that, are you following me? Am I correct, or?
I think I am. Let me give it a shot.
Okay. I mean, if I have 2 school districts, one, they both have 100 special needs students. One's got 75 kids that just need a little speech therapy, and they've got 25 kids that need some other services beyond that. One's got 25 kids that have a little services and 75 kids that are high cost.
Got it.
Your reimbursement rate that you're going to get is different from those 2 schools. It's exactly the same?
It's the same.
So how is the cost, I mean, okay, explain that to me.
There's a PD 363 form that calculates what the special ed funding is going to be, as well as the regular ed funding. Mr. Jones can probably elaborate on that formula a lot better than I can. We receive what we get, and essentially what you're saying is the truth. In a situation such as ours, we're the school with the, although it's not that extreme, but we're the school with the 75 that have high needs and the 25 that have low needs.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you receiving. I'm saying the school district that's sending. Those 2 schools would send you a different amount of money.
If driven out by their 363, their special education funding formula per student is identical, the formula is blind to the disability of the students that are going to the charter school.
Right, but if their funding per student is not identical, and if the one has 75 kids that don't have many needs at all, and the other's got 75 kids that have a lot of needs, their cost per student that they're currently spending before they send them is much higher in the school that's got a lot of kids with high needs. Correct. And so that's where it makes sense. If I'm a school district that has a lot of kids with low needs and only a few kids with high needs, my reimbursement to you is only going to be $20,000 or $15,000. So I'm going to try and send you the kid that's got $75,000 worth of needs. Conversely, the school district that's got a lot of kids with high needs, and their reimbursement to you might be $30,000 because their average cost is $30,000 per student. It's to your advantage to try and recruit a low incidence need kid from that school district because he's only going to cost you 10 and you're getting 30 for him. Correct? I mean, is that a fair? Okay. So what I hear you say is, yeah, so let's get that straightened out so that we can't be accused of scamming the system and the school districts can't be accused of scamming the system because one's trying to recruit and the other's trying to send and we're doing different students. Is that?
It could be. In our case, we're lottery. We take who we get. In our case, we're a lottery. We take who we get.
So you don't get to recruit?
Oh, no.
Right.
No, we don't.
Okay.
I don't think any of us really recruit other than.
Sure I do.
Yeah,
You
I was
do,
going to
but-
say, yeah.
And I think you raise a good point, and I think that's where it's fraught with abuse on both ends.
Right.
Exactly. You brought up the problem that lets it fraught for divorce. The school districts wanting to purge the very expensive student, and a nefarious operator wanting to over-identify or recruit low kids that aren't costly in their disability. You brought up one of the greatest places for abuse to occur in the funding with charter schools.
Yeah, and I think if we can tweak the formula, we can prevent those incentives on either side of that issue in terms of trying to do it. I've always contended that school districts don't have incentive to over-identify kids right now because they're only getting 30 cents on the dollar from the state, and any business manager that says, yes, let's over-identify so we can get 30 cents on the dollar should be fired tomorrow anyway, you know. But if I can calculate which one's costing me the most and which one's saving me the most and send or recruit based on that, then I can scam the system. And if we can eliminate that possibility, then I think we've accomplished something also in terms of funding for charters and cyber charters.
One thing I think you do have to remember, though, especially when you're talking about statewide cyber charter operators, once we recruit everybody. You know, once we make ourselves known and we advertise that we're available, we can't deny. You know, so those high-cost and low-cost kids will all know we're available. And so, you know, and I think that's why I'm kind of proud of our numbers and the fact that we mirror the state in special education. We're statewide. We have 8,000 kids. We should mirror special education population of the state if we're doing our job appropriately.
So then I guess my next question is, do you mirror the state in terms of what we will eventually hopefully get to, which is kids with low needs, kids with moderate needs, and kids with high needs as percentages of that 16%, which is sort of the statewide average? Do you do that now? Do you know that? Do you know that information? Is it, you know?
I think in large part that goes school to school. So I think from more so a state perspective, as a cyber, you could speak to that, but for brick and mortars, it's school to school.
Yeah, I can't speak to some of the other cyber charters. I know some of their numbers. There's some that are as low as under 10% special education. There's some that are over 20%. At CCR numbers fairly represent the state, a little higher represented in the very costly students. Not significantly, but we do have a higher percentage than the state average with that type of student.
Yeah, okay. Well, and hopefully the basic formula that we set out for all schools will help to rectify that so that if somebody does have 20% students, they'll actually get funding for 20% students. If somebody's got 10% students, they'll actually get funding for 10% students. It's still not going to be enough to cover it, but, you know. It's
And then you also have to consider, again, when you look at the difference between a smaller school and a larger school in a lottery situation. So when this Larry says 10 kids may come in who are high needs, that is going to make some difference in his percentages and also his costs, and may change how his special education department runs. With a school my size, if I have 6 kids who come in who are high needs, that's going to severely change my percentages, and it's now going to change the entire way our entire school operates for every child in that school. So again, some of the questions we can answer as one-offs, but it's hard to answer.
Yeah, and that's true for school districts also. If a small school district of 600 kids gets a family that, a foster family takes in 10 highly special needs kids, that blows that school district's budget. The whole,
Completely.
you know, it's done. So, one final question. In your testimony, you all quote, dollars received for special education, and you talked about special education funding. You get a regular ed reimbursement for the student, an additional special ed reimbursement, and a federal reimbursement that add up to when you talk about your special ed reimbursements or special ed funding, is that all 3 of those combined, or is it just the additional special ed funding and the federal funding, and doesn't include the regular ed funding that you get for that student?
In my testimony with CCA, that $16,000 number is a combination of regular ed and special education. But that is the special education rate. It counts the regular ed rate as part of that. That number did not include the additional federal funding.
Okay. That number did not include the additional.
Correct.
In my testimony for funding that we receive for special education services, I included that overage of the regular education and I included the federal dollars as well.
Okay, but not the regular ed
Not the
funding.
not the regular ed. But again, when I then juxtaposed that to my expenditures, the only thing I included was special ed coordinators, special ed teachers, paraprofessionals. And there was a slew of things I did not include that actually go towards special ed specifically as well. For example, my counselor spends a significant amount of time. My case manager spends a significant amount of time. We're a small school, so principals, myself, we actually are all involved in that process, where in larger schools, so for example, if you think of a school district, it's rare that you're going to have a superintendent that's going to sit in or potentially go to an IEP conference. But in a small charter school, that may happen and might happen quite frequently.
When I speak about money, we're a ballpark $8,200, $8,300 for a regular ed student, $19,660 for a special ed student, and then a lump sum for IDEA for support services based on identified kids. The number we were at up until about 3 years ago at about 30% of a population. We've been able to, through the years, reduce the number of students who do have IEPs. So we're down to about 25% now, but we're still so large that we actually need to carry we're two buildings. I have a K-8 and a 9-12 building for the K-12 program. We need to actually carry 2 special ed supervisors, one at each location. Not every charter school even has a special ed supervisor. We have 2 of them, so they pretty much can coordinate the program. And for us, every IEP is a step away from a lawsuit, possibly. And again, if you have a lawsuit and you have to pay compensatory education damages, we've been fortunate it hasn't been bad. But again, that's not something that's funded, but it's kind of your own fault, so you pay it. But with the 2 supervisors that we have, we're right on top of the law, we're right on top of providing the proper services, but there is an expense to it. So for those 2 positions alone, we're looking at benefits, PSERS, the whole bit, maybe $260,000, $270,000.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Lynn.
Thank you all for your time and your testimony this morning. I guess this is kind of a broad question, but it sounds as though at least all of you agree that we ought to be looking at some kind of a tiered system that looks at the severity of need for kids. Okay. Now, under the current system, as I understand it, particularly for traditional school districts, we assume that 16% of their kids are special ed. And obviously that's not the case. There's some school districts where it's less than that, some that it's more, I guess some that it's roughly the same. Does that make sense to you? Should we not be doing that? Should we actually be looking at each school district and figuring out what is their actual percentage? How many kids do they actually have that are classified as special ed?
I think it makes sense. I think, though, that again, and not to beat this horse, but if you're specifically, when you mention a smaller school district, so near where I live, Jenkintown, I think, has 800 students. They're smaller than a lot of charter schools. Again, if it's going to be adjustments made real time, because if that family moves in, and if 3 families move in and they're multi-student families and they each have several students with disabilities, then again, it's going to have a little bit more of a shift than what you may expect in a school district like Philadelphia. So I think that makes sense, but how quickly can the adjustments be made in real time?
And I think you actually raise a good 2-part question. I think any formula for any school entity has got to look in a tiered system based on the levels of the disabilities of the students served. Obviously, a significant need student needs a different reimbursement to that district than a low need student. But you also have to take into account the need of the student and the total population, because that's the only way you're going to provide some safety net for the smaller LEAs that end up with significant populations of high-need students. So it has to take both parts into account. Total number of special education students or percentage of students with needs as a component of regular ed, your total population, but you also have to tier it based on the level of services needed to be provided to those types of students in their LEA.
one question I have, as I understand it, so you get a flat rate per student based upon a formula that comes from the sending district. And tell me if I'm wrong on this, but as I understand it, for special education, the district looks at their total cost of special ed, but when they divide that cost to determine a per pupil level, they have to use that 16%. So if it's a school district that actually has 20% special ed, then it drives out a higher number because they're dividing by 16% of the students. Conversely, if it is a district that has less than 16%, say 10%, then the reverse is true. You're all shaking your heads. Is that a flaw in the current system? It seems like a flaw.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, particularly for school districts that have a higher percentage than the state average, not only when they get money from the state, perhaps they're being shortchanged. I think everybody's being shortchanged in the current system. I think we all agree with that, but perhaps they're being shortchanged. But also, when they send a child to a charter school, at least comparatively speaking, because of the way the formula, the denominator of that formula works, compared to their counterpart who's 10%, they're sending more, so to speak, and that's a flaw in the system. Okay, thank you.
Great. Secretary, have any questions? Chris? Chris, you may want to introduce yourself too, since you can't leave.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry I was delayed with traffic out of Lancaster. Thank you, Chairman, and also thank you for your testimony today, gentlemen. Mr. Jones, in your testimony, I noticed one of the recommendations, your last recommendation, was that intermediate units should be made to provide services and access to services in a manner consistent with that provided to the district, and then you put here in bold, please consider the concept of a statewide intermediate unit for Pennsylvania brick and mortar and cyber charter schools. I unfortunately was not here when you made that testimony, but I want to go a step further than that in terms of a kind of recommendation or an idea that was put out by another testifier at an earlier hearing of this commission, which was to get the IUs, require them to be involved, which was basically the idea to assign responsibility for providing special education services for students enrolled in charter schools to the intermediate unit of the student's residence. The district of residence would pay for the services rendered, and the charter school would receive no payments beyond regular education tuition from the district of residence, so that in essence we would be paying for the actual costs of those services rather than necessarily an average, which is what we have under the existing formula. So I'd just like you to comment on that. It's kind of taking your idea of, that the IUs have to, the concerns you've raised that you get different responses from IUs, but if we were to assign the IUs to actually take responsibility providing those services, which would take you out of that, which would, I don't know whether that's a good thing for you or a bad thing for you, or what, kind of would like your thoughts on that, as well as maybe further comments on your recommendation as well.
Certainly. I'll go to the
Sure.
the idea that was presented to you. There's a couple of concerns with that, and I know that that is something that is done in other states, but again, the devil's in the details. The structure's a little bit different. So one of the first things that would have to happen is that the charter school would have to lose or have suspended its LEA status with regards to special education, meaning now so if I'm the charter school, I have no child find responsibility as a LEA. If I'm the charter school, I'm kind of, stepping away from that concept. For a child who is now physically, for brick and mortar, in our building, then there's, let's be real with the world that we live in. It's a litigious society. If something goes wrong in this process and we're said to be completely out of this loop, is the charter school going to be held completely harmless and indemnified against anything that the intermediate unit may do incorrectly or inappropriately in the eyes of the parent, whether it be that or an attorney? The other issue now becomes one of pragmatics. If you have this interplay between making a child with a disability getting a free and appropriate public education that is seamless, where everything that goes on in a school environment works. You're going to have the special education staff, those who develop the IEP, the regular education staff, the principal, everyone is there. And then you have to ask the question, at some point in time, there does become a final arbiter. And who is that person? There's a decision that has to be made. So I think that is an idea, but actually where the rubber meets the road on that is how it works out day to day. And I think that there will inherently become some conflicts. And to some extent, I think, something that maybe many of you would understand, it would almost be like having an election where a candidate is running for an election but somebody else chooses his campaign manager. Now that could work out, but it might be problematic. Again, it might be a good idea, but how that works out day to day could be a problem. I don't know if that.
Yeah, that just is a second.
For the other idea, this again is just a concept, and I think it's born a lot out of what's going on in Philadelphia. And I don't want to sound like I'm bashing the Philadelphia IU, but that may be what it sounds like, and I'm not. I sit on the Great Schools Compact, and we are trying to do a lot of work in bringing together the school district, the IU, and charter school community, and working collaboratively for efficiency and also for what's best for children. The issue becomes that if you had an entity, and Larry mentioned in Philadelphia, an IU, that has representation from the charter school community, which that does not have in Philadelphia right now. So for those of you who may not know, when you have a school reform commission meeting in Philadelphia, at some point they stop the meeting midstream and say, we're now going to have an IU meeting. We're closing the school reform commission meeting and opening up the IU meeting, and the same people sit there, they take a vote, they close the IU meeting, and then go back to the school reform commission meeting, and this happens in a span of about 7 minutes. And there's no charter school representation there. So what you have is, if you had this IU concept where you're now providing services, where you actually have an IU that is not only open to working with charter schools and cyber charter schools, you've got an IU that understands by its very nature that it is there to support and work with and find efficiencies and find commonalities. So perhaps that IU could create some really interesting phenomena where instead of me calling someone like Larry, they can set up those connections and combinations also and find ways for charter schools to support. That's where that idea was born.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize. Chris Wakely came in a little later. Chris represents Representative Roebuck, who is the minority chairman of the House Education Committee. Thank you. Anyone else? Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you for coming to State College
so
today. It was a
much.
long drive for you, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. And if you're ever in the neighborhood, feel free to stop in.
I'm not far.
No, he's not.
Our next presenter is the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials.
Trade off.
Thank you for being with us today. If you feel free to introduce yourselves and then begin as you may. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Chairman O'Neill and Chairman Brown and the rest of the members of the commission. We are certainly pleased to have the opportunity to present to you testimony on behalf of the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials this morning on the issue of special education funding for charter schools, as it's something that is significant impact to our school districts. And as you've been working on taking a look at the state special education funding formula, this is a good next step and a good process to go through. So we're very pleased with that. My name's Hannah Barrick. I am the Director of Advocacy at Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials, PASBO. And with me this morning is Randy Brown. He is the Business Administrator at State College Area School District, and Jeff Ammerman, who is PASBO's Director of Technical Assistance. So the three of us are going to be walking you through sort of global statewide perspective on charter school special education funding. We will walk you through the 363 form, look at the funding in State College Area School District, and then end with some recommendations that we would urge you to consider as you move towards writing your report and coming up with recommendations for charter school special education funding. So just to start out, I know there were a lot of questions in the last panel about how the charter school special education funding works. And it's actually pretty simple calculation. The school code prescribes exactly how the tuition rate is to be determined. Section 1725A of the Public School Code sets out the requirements for regular education as well as special education. The regular education tuition rate works by school district, generally adds up a lot of their expenditures. They are allowed to deduct certain things from that calculation, and that amount per student is what goes to a charter school for a regular education student. If you have a special education student that is enrolled in a charter school, to that regular education amount, you add a special education amount, and you end up with a different dollar amount. So this special education calculation works by a school district looking at their total special education expenditures. They divide that, as was said earlier, by their total average daily membership times the 16%. So again, we're assuming the 16% special education incidence rate. That amount is added to the regular tuition rate, and that is the special education tuition rate that goes to the charter school. So this is determined every year by the school district. There's a PDE has a form, the 363. It's calculated, it's submitted to PDE, and that becomes the special education, regular education tuition rate for that school district, for that charter, to a charter school for that school year. Because this is based on the school district's total expenditures, there's a different amount that goes to every charter school from each school district. So there are 500 different rates for regular education and for special education. And again, based entirely on the school district's expenditures. So if you look at, I think there's a chart on page 2, it sort of shows the huge range that we have school districts paying to charter schools for special education. And while the regular education rate, there's definitely a range there. I think it's from about $6,400 per student to about $16,000 per student. The range in special education tuition rates is much, much more broad. We have, at the low end, districts paying about $12,000 per special education students to a charter school. At the high end, we have districts paying upwards of $41,000 per student to a charter school for special education. The median cost is about $18,000 per special education student, and this rate is a flat rate. So regardless of the exceptionality of the student, regardless of the services that the charter school is providing, regardless of the cost, the school district is paying their flat rate. So it's $41,000 to a charter school for a student that has a mild learning disability, maybe is pulled out of class for half an hour or twice a week for speech therapy, $41,000 for a student that has much more severe special education needs. Flat rate, regardless of the exceptionality. So that is how the funding formula generally works. In some of the previous hearings, and even at this hearing this morning, we heard the discussion about over-identification, and I know that at the previous hearings, you had asked the school districts whether or not they thought there was an incentive for school districts to over-identify special education students, and I think sort of resounding answer was no. The way that the current funding formula works for school districts, the fact that there's been level funding for 6 years, the fact that we're assuming a 16% special education incidence rates across the board, there's no incentive for a school district to over-identify. That they're not getting the funds. As soon as they sort of bump up above that 16%, they're hurting, and it's just more and more dollars coming out of this district budget. So I don't think we see that problem when we are looking at school districts. I think that there is the potential, based on the way the current formula is done with the flat rate going to a charter school, regardless of the exceptionality, I think there's the potential for the incentive on the other side for charter schools. One thing, the way that the formula works now, again, it's certainly a higher rate than the regular education rate that goes to charter schools, because we are adding on top this additional percentage based entirely on the school district's expenditures in special education. It's the flat rate that's going to the charter school, regardless of the exceptionality, regardless of the actual cost of the services provided. And on top of that, there's not a lot of transparency, because all that the school district will see when a student enrolled in a charter school receives an IEP and is designated as special education, all they will see is the cover page of the IEP. So they don't get any information about what services the student is receiving at the charter school, what their exceptionality is. They just see the cover page, and that's it. They're not permitted to receive any additional information unless there's a situation where the parent is providing consent. So because of that, because of the way the current formula works, I think that there is at least the potential for an incentive to over-identify at a charter school, where I think on the flip side of a school district, at least it might not be quite so financially beneficial in some circumstances. I think that regardless of whether or not there's over-identification at all, the impact on school districts for paying the charter school's special education tuition is pretty significant. And if you look at the chart that is on page 3, you can see that the chart looks at the state funding that school districts receive each year for special education compared to the amount of dollars that they are paying to charter schools for special education. You can see there's a range there. We have some school districts that are paying basically 100% or more of every dollar that comes in from the state for special education funding. They are paying out every 100% or more of that to charter schools for special education. Sort of average is about 31%, so generally of every dollar that a school district receives in special education state funding, they are paying out about 30 cents to charter schools for special education services and costs. So that's a huge, huge amount. And because we have had flat funding in school districts for special education for the past 6 years, this is a problem that has really been exacerbated, and more of the burden of special education services in the district is being pushed on to the local taxpayers. So that's a really important thing to look at as you are sort of considering this and looking at the formula. Another important sort of piece to look at when you're looking at the current formula is to look at what the charter schools are spending, or what they're receiving per student, and what they are spending per student. And so we looked at some of the numbers on average, and on the chart on page 4 illustrates this pretty well. Based on 11-12 data, we looked at the total expenditures for special education for school districts. So school districts are spending, on average, you include all their special education instructional costs, you include all the ancillary costs, so the legal, the medical, guidance services, psychology services, transportation, all of that. They are spending, on average, about $15,000 per special education student. Now, granted, there's definitely a spectrum there. Some districts have very high-end costs, and their costs are much, much higher, but on average, it's $15,000 per student, statewide average, yep. When we look at the median rate that a school district is paying a charter school for special education, it's about $18,000 per student. So already, right there, we're paying, on average, a little bit higher than school districts are spending. When we looked at what the charter schools are actually spending statewide for special education services, again, we looked at their actual special education expenditures. We looked at some of the ancillary costs that they will have just like school districts, and found that they are spending on average about $9,300 per special education student, despite the fact that they are receiving about $18,000 per special education student. So there is a huge disparity there. And granted, there is certainly a spectrum. These are statewide average numbers. But I think that this is a clear indication that something needs to be done with the formula. Something needs to be examined and needs to be put in a direction that makes it a little bit more equitable on both sides. And so I'm going to turn it over to Randy. He's going to walk you through the specific funding in State College Area School District and walk you through the 363 form, just to get a better idea of how school districts are doing the calculation that results in the tuition rates that go to the charter schools.
There should be two one-page documents. One that is titled State College Area School District.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. There should be two one-page documents. One that says State College Area School District, and then the other at the top, it says Funding for Charter Schools. That's the 363 document for State College Area School District. Hannah has just talked about the ranges and the medians across the districts in the state. In State College, the amount of charter school tuition that we pay is right around $11,000 over the last 3 years. And that is right about in the middle of the ranges across the states for a non-special education student. The statewide range was $6,400 to $16,000. The special education rate that we are paying was $22,000, as the first chart on the page shows, $22,419 in 2011-12, moving to just under $22,000 in 2012-13, and then for the current year, 2013-14, we'll be looking at $23,825, almost $24,000, and that's for a special education student, which is, again, in the midpoint of the range statewide, which was moving, as Hannah said, from $12,000 to $41,000 per student. In the charter schools in the students that attend charter schools from the State College Area School District, there are 290 students that are non-special education students and 60 that are special education students. When you look at that difference or additional amount paid to the charter school districts for those students receiving special education services, that difference amounts to about $600,000 a year. It's about a $10,000 difference between a non-special education and a special education student tuition rate. And that's a sizable dollar amount. So I appreciate that you're looking at this and trying to find a more equitable manner to handle this. State College School District is fortunate. We have about an 11% incidence rate of special education students right now. If you switch to the other page, which is the 363, this is a prescribed document from the Department of Education. We will start with our total expenditures for non-special education students, and then deduct. We start with total expenditures for the entire district. We're calculating our expenditures for non-special education students. We will take deductions, which are on the back of that sheet. Those deductions are primarily for, obviously, special education, because that's going to be handled separately. And then the majority of the other expenses are adult education, community and junior college programs that districts may have, and federal expenses that are funded from the federal dollars that we receive. When we subtract those deductions, then we come up with our selected expenditures, divide that by our average daily membership, and that's how we come up with our non-special education student tuition rate. For the special education students, we start by taking our special education expenditures, deduct out any federal expenditures that we have received that funding from the federal government. We come up with a new total, divide that number, which is our average daily membership rate, multiplied that by that 16% that we've been talking about, and that gives us a special education tuition rate or adjustment, and in State College's case for next year, it's $12,074.75. Add that to the non-special education tuition rate, giving you a total special education tuition rate of $23,825.
Before you go on, can I ask you one question?
Absolutely.
Make this clear for the committee. You deducted your IDA dollars right there, the $880,000?
That's correct.
Okay. The charter and charter cyber schools receive their own IDA money on top of what you send them for 23 for their students?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
So we have been looking at this issue and have come up with just a couple of recommendations as you work your way through this complex problem, or not problem, this complex issue. And I think that, like the panel before us, I think we all generally have the same goals. We want to make sure that there is appropriate funding for the students out there that need it. We need to have special education funding and the resources available to provide to those students regardless of where they are. I think from the school district point of view, we want to also make sure that the payment is appropriate. We are not overpaying for any of the services, and I think that is one of the critical things to look at with the current funding formula. So one of the sort of more basic recommendations that we would have would be to just require a little bit more transparency with respect to the information that a school district receives from a charter school when a student receives an IEP when they go to the charter school. As I said before, all the school district receives is the front page of the IEP, which just basically contains the student's name and designates that they have an IEP in place. It doesn't contain information about the exceptionality, about the cost, about the services that are required for that student. Because the school district is footing the entire bill for these students that are enrolled in charter schools, the school district has a vested interest in at least having a little bit more information, especially since right now they're paying a flat fee regardless of what the exceptionality is, what the services are provided. So we realize that there are some privacy issues there, and certainly not asking for the entire IEP. But I think that some additional transparency would be beneficial to the school district who is paying for that student. Some of the other recommendations we have deal more with the funding formula. And one of our recommendations would be to focus really on the charter school's total special education expenditures and to do sort of a reconciliation at the end of the year. So where you have a school district that is paying more per student to that charter school than they're actually spending, you should refund the difference to the school district. This shouldn't be too complicated to do. Charter schools have this information, figure out what they're spending at the end of the year per student. Again, every school district is sending a different amount, so some districts might get money back, some districts might not get money back. But in those situations where school districts are overpaying based on the actual services that the charter school is providing to their students, the excess money should be refunded. Certainly, there would be a need to include some measures there to prevent over-identification, or at least reduce an incentive for that, and I think with all these proposals, that certainly is a goal. But I think that is something that it would at least go towards getting more at the actual cost of special education. Another recommendation that we have, and this was sort of touched on by the earlier panel as well, where a school district or where a charter school is sending a special education student to an intermediate unit or even to a school district to receive special education services, perhaps the school district should pay the charter school the regular education amount and cover the cost of the special education services provided by the IU or by the school district. Right now, the way that the sort of money path works is if a charter school sends a student to an IU, the IU bills the charter school bills the school district pays the charter school, and the charter school pays the IU. So it's a sort of complicated process that could probably be easily streamlined if you were to go that direction and just sort of allow the school district to cover those costs. Certainly there would be some consequences for school districts, and it certainly might increase costs, so I think that would have to be looked at it in a balanced manner to make sure that school districts were able to cover those costs. And perhaps as you develop a new special education funding formula, you could include a school district's charter school expenses in that if they were covering those expenses through students at the IU. And the final two recommendations that we have deal with specifics on the PDE 363 form and are potentially quick fixes to at least make the funding formula a little bit more equitable. So I'm going to let Jeff discuss those.
Again, thank you for allowing us to testify today. Randy walked you through his particular 363, and we've kind of talked about it specifically, what those numbers look across the state. So we were trying to determine, one of the pieces was, why is it that the average special education cost for a district is $15,000, yet the median amount is $18,000 that go to charter schools? And one of the potential flaws, we believe, is that instructional costs may be double counted for certain students who are in special education. So you develop that base rate based on an instructional cost for a regular education student, and then added on to that is an additional amount that also captures instructional costs for special education students. For those special education students who are educated primarily in regular education classrooms, we believe that there is a potential here of double counting of instructional costs for special education. So the 363 is the key form that drives this out, and we think that we need further investigation into, does that occur and how much does that occur as we move forward to try to develop a better special education formula for charter schools. The other piece, and a lot of discussion has taken place here in the previous panel and with Randy and Hannah so far, but we believe the assumed 16% special ed incidence rate creates any number of issues. So using that rate can create some issues, and we'll walk through an example. Our recommendation is that each school district be able to use either the greater of their actual special education incidence rate or 16% in their special ed charter tuition calculation on that PD 363 form. So we'll walk through an example where these numbers are relatively in line. So we have let's consider a district that has 2,000 ADMs, 2,000 students, and that spends $3 million $3 million in total on special education students, which is about $15,000 per student, which is about the average. But in this particular district, instead of having a 16% incidence rate, they actually have 20% of their students who are special education. Well, if we use the current formula, you don't get to recognize that 20% of your students. You only use the 16% of your students. So $3 million divided by 16% of 2,000 is 320 students, or you get an add-on for the special education costs of $9,375 per student. That's over and above what would be added on to the basic regular education tuition rate. We didn't calculate that here. So this would be $9,375 over and above what they're paying for a regular education student. If you were, in this instance, to use the district's actual incidence rate of 20%, so instead of having 16%, they have 20%, the math is still the same. There's $3 million spent on special education costs, but you're going to divide that by 400 students and get a much lower amount of $7,500 per special education student. So because of the assumed incidence rate, this district with this set of facts is paying more than $1,800 more per special education student just based on this 16% assumption. So we feel that, again, the 16% amount needs to be investigated, and we're recommending changing how that formula would work. So with that, we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this important topic. We appreciate all the work that you've done to ensure that the special education funding, whether it be state funding to school districts or charter school tuition rates, is fair and equitable across the Commonwealth. And all three of us are here to answer whatever questions you may have.
Great, thank you very much. Just quickly, I was looking at the chart that was provided to us by the cyber school and their contracted services. And going through that list, I noticed that a lot of those services are provided within most, if not all, public schools via, hired professionals that work for the district, so it's not contracted out. So it would be my assumption that the dollars being paid to provide that student with those services from in-house is less than it would be to contract it out. Is that a fair assumption? I mean, you're certainly not paying your school psychologist $105 an hour.
I think that generally the districts that are large enough to provide their own special education services in-house can do so at a lower cost than those who do have to go outside.
And is that the majority of school districts that can provide a lot of their services? Okay, well, if you can't answer, that's fine.
I would be, I wouldn't want to make a generalization because, again, it really does depend on both demographics and number of special education. So relatively small districts, I think, would probably lean more towards outplacements. Larger districts, I guess it really comes down to, I'm not quite sure how that group in the middle,
right.
where they would fall.
That's what I expected. My last question is, in comparing, you were talking about, where is it? What the average they spend is 9,000, and they're receiving 18, and the average for the state is 15. I guess my question is, looking at their contracted services, that it seems to me that just from looking at it, that it would cost more to educate a student with special needs in a cyber school than in a public school because of the contracting out of almost all the services. So that's just my assumption from what was presented to us today. Given that presumption on my part, would you say that it does cost more to provide special services for a student in a cyber school than in their home school district? Like, for example, they were talking about when they have to do testing. It takes 4 days of traveling, sending people out and everything, whereas in the home school, it's done right there in one location, in the school district, so forth. So,
I would just say we looked at AFR data, so the data we pulled together that we have in front of you are
so
based
the data
on,
you have is just real numbers then.
right, based
Okay.
on, so it comes down to, I think there are certainly instances where that can occur, and there are instances where that doesn't occur. It's sort of like the same situation with school districts. It would depend on the size of the cyber charter school or the charter school and whatever arrangements they could do themselves.
What is the percentage, do you have any idea what the percentage of students who go on to, and the parents and the student make the decision to go to a charter or cyber school, did not have an IEP when they left, but got one when it was deemed they needed and it was appropriate when they got there?
Yeah, we don't have any information,
You don't have
on,
any
on
information?
that, unfortunately, no.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Senator.
Thank you. Thank you all for your tremendous assistance in what we're doing. One of the things I'm having difficulty with, and unfortunately, they reflect on this from an accounting background. Some of this stuff is difficult to swallow, just because the numbers don't match costs, and the balance sheet doesn't balance. I guess I have to take the accounting hat off because I'll drive myself crazy. The one question that I think inevitably would come up as a result of recommendations, and just your thoughts on this, in regards to tuition reimbursements as opposed to cost. Somebody may ask, the reimbursement's too high to a charter school because the cost of service is a lot lower. Someone may ask the inverse, is why the cost of service coming from the host institution is so much higher. And that's something that I think is important to address from a standpoint of reimbursement. And maybe those are the kind of things, at least, that we need to at least note in our report as far as why that is different. Just some initial thoughts on that, because the relative differences between the receiving institution as opposed to the distributing institution is, on average, is pretty significant here. And does that affect how we weight the different categories of service? Do you have any thoughts on that at this point, or we can get into that later? I know it's a real pretty general question, because we're talking about averages.
Well, I mean, I think at sort of a basic level, when you look at the total expenditures of the school district versus the total expenditures of a charter school, to some degree, we're including different things. So part of the total cost of the school district includes the transportation, which is about, like 9% approximately?
Is this a fully included cost, $9,300? Is that apples to apples?
What we attempted to do, we have the AFR data for for school districts. So we know not just the 1,200, not just the instructional costs, but we know what the transportation costs and so forth are. For charter schools, we assumed that we would just take out that transportation. We recognize, based on some of the testimony earlier, and we have looked at the numbers, that there are some transportation costs that charter schools do incur, but it's significantly less than what school districts do. So we marked up the 1,200 instructional costs by 10% for charter schools. We had the data for the, so in many ways, this is a best estimate at apples to apples. Overall, districts spend about 16% more than their instructional costs for total special education costs. So even if we were to mark up that number by 16% instead of the 10% that we did for charter schools, you're still coming up with a significantly smaller number than what districts are spending in total.
And again, we're trying with the least amount of data collection burden on school districts to do this. Trying to come up with something that's closer services provided to reimbursement. It seems to me that it would be better from a cash flow perspective for a school district to come up with a reimbursement rate. I guess it's an education code that adjusts per need, so that you can distribute based on the cost of service and have them spend based on the cost of service rather than receiving and sending back. I'm not sure, and we're going to work through this. I'm not sure if we're asking too much when it comes to data collection, but I know that you do, and we've talked about this, provide for a cost of service per student in different ranges. And if we had to have a component of the formula that relates to distribution directly from school districts to charters, as opposed to the state formula, that it would better match what they're actually spending, so you don't have that cash flow issue. Is just an amendment to your recommendation. Does that make sense?
And I think that that is a fantastic idea. You know, I think we sort of came at this from, you know, if we assume that we're keeping the formula the same, keeping the flat rate, here's how we could get to it. I do not think we would be opposed to dealing with that issue on the front end and adjusting based on the actual cost.
You can assume we're desperately trying to make sure the formula is not the same.
Yes.
And I know you're working. I know you're working with us on that. I appreciate that. And the other part is the 16%, going below or higher than 16%. I would think that it wouldn't have to be the higher of the two. It could be an actual incidence rate and just do away with that reference altogether, so that it's actually accurate. It wouldn't be higher than 16 and not lower. It could be 13, 12, or 11, or the actual student count in your last recommendation. And I think that's what we're trying to get to as well. And you know, you're helping us get there, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. And just to follow up with the Senator, could you get me the following information? How many school districts in the Commonwealth of the 500 are at the current 16% or lower?
Sure.
That would be, Representative Sterling.
Thanks. One quick question, and I don't know how it factors into anybody's figures, and I didn't get a chance to ask the past panel about this, but a lot of the services that I know they talked about, you know, costing $125 an hour, $150 an hour, those kind of things. If a student is already identified with a disability, in a lot of cases, those students are MA qualified. And a lot of these services, whether it's you know, neuropsychological evaluations or some of those, are paid for by MA. Are any of those things calculated into their cost or your cost? Or, I mean, does the MA reimbursement get included anywhere here as a part of the costs or not?
The deductions are based on federal expenses. So right now, when the 363 is completed, you do take off your federal expenses. So to the degree that those are reported, the medical access expenses are reported as federal, that would be a deduction that comes off. So those expenses would essentially not be added back to the special ed expenses. So it's kind of in a different way those come off.
Okay.
But it comes off as a deduction for federal expenses.
Okay. All right. And then one question for a gentleman from State College. So you said your actual special ed participation rate is 11%, not 16%. So I did a quick calculation here, and if you were filling out the funding for charter schools formula and you only got to divide by 11%, you would actually be spending another $6,000 per student more. If you, so somebody like you would get hurt if we changed the formula to actually reflect the number of students. But what percentage of students total do you have that are going to charter or cyber charter schools?
We are at about 12%. We have right around 7,000 students. It's about 10%, excuse me. We have right around 7,000 students, and we have about 700 in, nah, that's not correct.
350 in.
We have 350, yes.
So you have 5%.
5%.
Okay, all right. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Longetti.
Senator Brown pointed to his accounting background, and numbers not adding up, driving him crazy, but I thought his tax law background, dealing with the illogical tax code, that wouldn't be such a problem. Couple questions. So as I understand it, when you figure out what you send to the charter school for special education, you're looking at your total cost to begin with. And I think Representative Sterla mentioned what the state sends you might be 30 cents on the dollar, so your total cost is a whole lot more than what the state actually sends you. So I know in your testimony you talked a little bit about different school districts sending different amounts, obviously. Are there some school districts that could send actually more than 100% of what they receive from the state to charter schools?
Yeah, there are a handful of school districts that are spending over 100%. On the chart, there was one school district that's spending like 314% of their actual state special education funding dollars would be going to charter schools for special education services.
So
Yes.
there's at least one that's at 314% of what they get from the state.
And there are several that are above 100%.
Okay. So we don't, in the current law, we don't have any kind of cap that says school districts should not have to pay more than they receive from the state over in tuition for special ed. There's no cap.
There's no cap.
Okay. And I know Senator Brown alluded to it. You talked a little bit in your testimony about the importance of looking at the actual percentage for a school district. And if it's 20%, then we ought to be using 20%. But you did mention that you thought the floor should be 16. Is there any consideration? I know the other issue for you is reconciliation at the end of the year. Is there any consideration from your membership, or you're prepared to answer, if we did reconciliation, is it more palatable than to look at actual percentage when the percentage is less than 16%?
I think that we would. I think that we probably would. Again, we recommended looking at the higher, the greater of 16%, or the actual special education incidence rate. We're going to have school districts like State College Area School District where they have a lower special education incidence rate, and that's going to negatively impact them. I think if we had the choice, and this is certainly a larger discussion that we'd have to have as an association, I think we would certainly prefer the reconciliation to focus more on the actual cost of the charter school and making the payments, as opposed to potentially hurting some school districts that would be negatively impacted if we used the actual incidence rate that was below 16%.
And I understand this is a discussion that you need to have further, but there's some appeal to the idea that if we're going to look at above 16%, that we ought to look at below, but reconciliation also is an issue that I think school districts are really focused on. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Chris?
Thank you, Chairman. Looking at your recommendations, two quick questions. The first one, on your first recommendation on the transparency in terms of getting more information than just the cover sheet, what would need to be changed? Would it need to be state law, federal law, regulations? And if you could provide us with the language in order to do that, what would that be?
I mean, right now, I know that there is a BEC that sort of clarifies as, or specifies as to what a charter school may and may not send a school district when there has been a designation and an IEP has been in place, and it says, it's the cover sheet, you may not send anything additional with the, unless there's been parental consent. So that really, and that's all school districts receive, and again, charter schools, they can't send anything other than that, per the requirement there. But I think that is one area that just some additional transparency to have a better understanding of what exactly the charter or the school district is paying for, what the services are, what the exceptionality is, would be beneficial because the school district is currently on the hook for those costs.
So that's right now through a BEC.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you do that in terms of regulation, or do you think we'd have to actually pass legislation? My concern is when it comes to legislation, then you get into FERPA and, the concerns that you do get from people about, that information.
Mm-hmm. And there certainly are privacy issues
Sure.
out there, and we certainly wouldn't want to run afoul of that. I think we can take a look at it and see if there's language that we could recommend to make sure that we're walking the fine line
Right.
between getting the information that would be beneficial, but not sort of overstepping or running afoul of the privacy requirements.
The fourth recommendation you have concerns the 363 calculation on the double counting. And you talk about, you're talking about special education students who are educated primarily in the regular education classroom, to kind of not have a double dip, if you will, there. Have you thought of, or in terms of your data, of looking at what percentage, in other words, is it 70% of the time they're primarily in the school district, 80%, 90%? What do you think is an accurate figure if we were to do that, or have that used? What would be a fair, accurate figure for that?
I would say we haven't gone into that level of detail at this point. We've sort of identified the concept, but that's something that we need to spend more time to try to drill down to what real level of double counting occurs. So I don't know that number, but that's something we can spend more time working.
I just think at some point, if we were to go down that road, we're going to need some sort of figure as to, what gets counted in as this and what is and what's not in terms of. So I'll be interested in seeing whatever data or a recommendation you would make on that, and then be able to get some feedback on that. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions? Thank you for being with us. If you, the added information that we're requesting from you, if you could get it to either Vicki or Judy, we'd appreciate it. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming out here today. Next, we have a panel of parent and advocate. And while they're setting up, we're going to take a quick 3-minute break to give everybody a quick break to run to the facilities. Okay, we're going to begin. Senator Brown. Very quickly. Next up, we have a panel of 3 parent and advocates that would like to speak to us today. So if you'll each introduce yourself and a little about where you're from and your background, although I know 2 of you are from. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Cindy Deutsch. I'm the parent of an 18-year-old son who has just walked graduation. He has autism. I'm also the Director of Parent Advising at the Peel Center, Parent Education Advocacy Leadership. Jane?
Okay.
Oh, from Pittsburgh.
Yeah, from Pittsburgh. Hi, I'm Jane Stadnick. I'm a parent of an 11-year-old son, Jacob, also with autism, and I'm from the Ambridge area, which is a little west and north of Pittsburgh.
Hello, my name is Audrey Rasmussen. I have 2 children with autism. I'm also an attorney in private practice, and I represent families in special education matters. I live and practice in Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Great. So you're all Eagles fans? No? I just say that. That, my father-in-law will be watching this, and the Steeler fan that he is.
I brought a picture of my son,
Yeah.
Andrew. This is his senior picture. He
Looks just
walked
like
to
you.
graduation. So to start formally, good afternoon, Senator Brown, Representative O'Neill, and members of the Special Education Funding Commission. Thank you for your commitment to the education of Pennsylvania students with disabilities and for inviting the testimony of parents and advocates on this issue. Thank you. My name is Cindy Dooch, and I am here today as both a parent and an advocate. The parents that are here and the parents that we represent feel strongly about their child's education and are always wanting to partner with the schools and make sure that our kids are getting what's appropriate for them. In my role as a parent, I've been actively involved in my son Andrew's education since we received his diagnosis of autism at the age of 3. From the beginning, I knew that his needs would be different from that of his peers, and in many cases, I would have to be the advocate for appropriate services for him. Knowing that his career in school would span greater than 12 years, it made sense that I was fully committed to his education with typical peers in the school he would attend if he did not have a disability. He's been included since preschool, getting either autism support or learning support, and has always been in his least restrictive environment of his home school in general ed classes with supports and services. The school district we were in when Andrew began kindergarten is a very diverse school district. According to Penn data, greater than 50% of the students in that district are African American. The disability population of students in that school district exceeds 16%. Andrew was included with his typical peers for most of his day in general education classes and had autism support available when he needed it. His socialization and behavior at the time was of great concern, and continues to be. In 2nd grade, when his behavior escalated, it was suggested by the principal that he move to a different school in the school district. I knew as a parent and in my gut that there was resources available that the school wasn't using, either through Patton, through the IU, or through a contracted consultant that I had learned the school did consult with. So after a number of meetings, we did have the consultant come in, observe Andrew, make recommendations to his team for a behavior plan, and it worked. And by the end of his elementary school, Andrew was going through his day with very little help from an aide. His behavior plan was working for him. He was doing well. He was learning appropriate social skills and was with his typical peers. This was important to us as a family because as we were always thinking ahead of Andrew's long-term goals, it was apparent that his social skills acquisition was vital to his success. The staff at his elementary school was creative. They had to be. At the disability population exceeded 16% of the funding, or exceeded the 16% funding, they were working on a very limited budget. So the speech teacher or the guidance counselor would get together a lunch bunch. Kids who had disabilities and kids who did not have disabilities, and bring them together for lunch. She would facilitate some games, facilitate conversation. These were things Andrew needed to learn, and in this environment, because he did model typical peers. So this was successful for him. And it really didn't cost the district at that point any extra money to do this because they were working with what they had. And his peers loved the attention that they got during the lunch bunch. They all wanted to be part of the lunch bunch. This also afforded them all the ability to form friendships with Andrew and with others outside of their regular circle of friends. It was in his middle school years that we decided we would move to another school district. The school district wasn't much further away, but had an excellent reputation for academic excellence. Along with Andrew, I have another son whose education is equally important to us. This new school district which does not have the diversity of our previous district at 96% white, was a new experience for Andrew as well as for me. Despite a lower population of kids with disabilities, 10%, there was no autism support in this school. There continues to be no autism support in this school. The district saying that they can educate kids in learning support. As I'm sure you're aware or have heard, the needs of children with autism excuse me, are pretty unique and oftentimes need some specialization. With no autism support and little besides workbook instruction for social skills in this new school district, Andrew's needs related to autism weren't always met. Despite my advocacy, the wealthier district could not always provide the specialized instruction that Andrew needed. It was sometimes 1 or 2 years that his needs related to autism, in this case perseveration and anxiety, would go without the appropriate support from a teacher who had this specialized knowledge and experience to help him. In this school district, Andrew's social skills were taught in a life skills classroom. Life skills classroom is all children with disabilities, and some a little more challenging than Andrew's are, and via a workbook. Research indicates that social skills cannot be effectively taught by use of a workbook because children with autism do not have the ability to easily generalize these social skills and have to use the skills in an active way in order to be successful. Having walked graduation this spring, Andrew is currently attending Project Search at UPMC Passavant Hospital and working part-time at a large supermarket as a bagger. Andrew is interested in politics, and he votes. He anticipates much success and independence in furthering his education, independent living, and recreational activities. Finally, as a director of parent advising for the Peel Center, let me explain the Peel Center. Under IDEA, every state has to have at least one parent training and information center to assist families whose children receive special education services. In Pennsylvania, we have 2. Penn, the Parent Education Network, serves the eastern side of the state, including Philadelphia, and Peel serves western and central part of the state, 43 counties in western and central PA. Again, we're federally funded to provide information and resources to families who have children receiving special education services kind of through the maze. It's a very difficult system to understand, and this is what we're here for parents for. In the last fiscal year, we assisted 7,500 families, either through information, resources, or attending trainings. These weren't families that were calling us up and saying, we're so happy with our school district services. These were families who were at the end of their ropes, didn't know what their rights were, weren't aware of what their rights were, weren't aware that the rights they had were that they had the ability to disagree with the school district. There are parents who were getting services from a school district who either could not or would not provide services to the children. Fair does not mean equal. I'm very happy that this commission will be making some positive changes to districts across Pennsylvania with an equitable funding formula. School districts will be able to provide appropriate supports and services for their students with disabilities so that they may experience success in academics and in all aspects of their life. Thank you.
Again, my name is Jane Stadnick, and I have an 11-year-old son named Jacob who is imaginative and witty and funny and does typical 11-year-old boy things. And but he also has ASD, which is also known as autism spectrum disorder. He was diagnosed at 3, and we've been in the special education system since he was 4. He is 3 academic years behind his peers with the same IQ, or if not higher than his peers. we've found ourselves looking outside of the public education system, charter, cyber, homeschool. But I always come back to the fact that we know those services are in public education, and we know that those parents that came before us fought the good fight so our children could be educated in a public education system. So, you know, as my husband says, I plunge ahead and, you know, make sure he has the services, and then the people, the families that come behind us, so they have the services also. So let me start by listing some of Jacob's services that he has received or is receiving at this time. He has speech, occupational therapy, autism support, learning support, emotional support. He has a personal care assistant, which is billed through Medicaid. There's a social worker available and an autism consultant from the Watson Institute. There may have been a few others in there. I might have missed some. It's been a long journey, and we're not even halfway there. But first and foremost, out of all of that, I want to let you know that, and I'm sure it's like other parents, I don't expect the school to do it all for me. A lot of these services I have taken to him privately. Some have been paid for by medical insurance, some by Medicaid, some out of pocket. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't always expect the school to do everything for us. In fact, we probably do a lot of homeschooling on top of regular school. Our school is lucky we have a dedicated speech teacher on staff. So when we talked earlier, you know, as I'm sitting listening to everybody's stuff, I'm like, oh, I want to put that in there. Oh, I want to talk about that. Contracting out is not always the best way. We have a dedicated speech teacher. She's available to his regular education teachers. She comes to his IEP meetings, and she makes sure that his goals for speech also mimic his education goals as a whole. We have occupational therapy, which goes over handwriting, eye-hand coordination, board-to-paper copying, and also works on his sensory needs, as most children on the spectrum have anxiety and other sensory issues that go on, especially in noisy environments like classrooms with, you know, 26 plus kids. And but they're contracted out. So I have phone conversations maybe halfway through the year. I get a report every 9 weeks about if he's meeting his goals, but there's really no communication that goes on between the occupational therapist and his regular education, which is where we want him. We want him in his classroom, not pulled out. We want him included. So, in all of the support classes, autism support, learning support, emotional support, because they never quite know where to put him. You know, he's not really a behavior problem. In fact, he'll sit back and play with his pencil in the back of the classroom and nobody will know he's there, which is not what I want him to do. I want him to sit in the front and do his work. So he's had all of these: autism support, learning support, emotional support. Now they're manned by a teacher and usually a teaching assistant or an aide. Not necessarily one trained in special education. The teachers themselves may be special education trained, but not necessarily. I actually last year had a young teacher tell me that this is how you get your foot in the door. She says, teaching a support class until a regular ed class opens up. And in hindsight, I guess I was happy that something opened up, because we really do need teachers in there that want to be in there. Also, the aides are pulled into other classrooms. They're not always available in the class. So these support classes, you know, they're pulled out because since he is 3 academic years behind, for math and reading, he's pulled out. He's not in a regular education setting for math and reading. Even though he probably could be for reading, math might be a little beyond where he is. But so if the aide is busy with someone else, Jacob does this work over here, and if he doesn't choose to focus on the work, because sometimes you have to remind him, you're working, you know, because he'll kind of go off into his own Jacob world. And so he'll often sit for 20 minutes to 30 minutes at a time and not really do anything educational. You know, and we all talk about having breaks and things with kids on the spectrum need frequent sensory breaks, but 30 minutes at a time is not appropriate. It's not an appropriate education. So in the regular education classes, Jacob shares an aide with 2 other boys. He's had these same 2 boys with him since first grade. They're like an old married couple some days. I'm sure no homeroom teacher wants them all 3 in her class at the same time. I don't think I'd want them all 3 in my class at the same time. They all have an aide that they share. This aide does not stay the same from year to year, so they don't really know your children. And as we found out, not usually trained as an autism specialist or much training at all. The one year, an aide asked me during open house whether or not Jacob could actually learn. And I'm like speechless, and that doesn't usually happen to me. But my heart sank, because I'm like, we need to be on the same page, you and I. You need to know that he can learn, but she had no background in autism whatsoever. She was a special education teacher before she retired, and at that point everybody was just MR. There wasn't a huge, most of those children were probably in an institution. And so, you know, that's been difficult for us as far as you switch aides, and, you know, he's relatively easy to get along with, but if you don't know him or don't look at a paper, I write a snapshot every year of what Jacob likes to do and what are the things that kind of irritate him and how you can get him to work a little bit better. If they don't actually get to read that, because I found that it probably sits in the teacher's mailbox, so I have to usually go to open house with my little stack of papers and go, oh, you're my son's aide. Nice to meet you. Here, read this. We also have a social worker that covers all 3 of our elementary schools. So I'm not really quite sure what she gets accomplished. But we do have one. So over all this, you might notice that we utilize a lot of different services. And if you go to our school's website, there are even more services listed. We've got a ton of services available. But what isn't said is that our school is at 17.1%. I never thought I'd have to know that number ever. So we're above the 16%. So our budget is a little stretched thin. We had a charter school just open up. I'm not quite sure statistically how many children went there, but I know there's a lot. I know several families that are there. Probably what's helping them out is they're only up to 2nd grade at this point. So nobody is shifting them to the higher grades. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, we have all these services in place, but that saying a mile wide and an inch deep, it pertains here. So we get services, but they're not really utilized effectively. So, you know, if we're going to fund services, we need to make sure that we have, first of all, enough money to offer the services. I mean, I would much prefer a school district going, you know what, we're going to have to be creative. Let's think of another way. Then tell me, oh yeah, we can do that. And then not actually get done. I mean, as parents, I sit through a minimum of 3 IEP meetings a year for my son. Not just meetings like, how do you do? Like, I can't just go in there and have a parent-teacher conference. When I say, hey, we need to have a meeting, everybody shows up. And I'm like, I'm really not one of those parents. I really do want the education system to work for my child. I will do everything possible as a parent, and most parents will, to help the school district understand my son better, because it works for both of us. It makes the teachers and the school's job easier, and in the end, I get a child that's more independent and hopefully tax-paying in the end than just the child that has to be on Medicaid or complete disability in a home. I don't want that for my son, and I'm sure that many other parents don't want that for their children either. So through all these IEP meetings and stuff, I like to call it, I don't like to call it a meeting. I like to call it a negotiation, because as parents, we write the top, this is my thought process. I write the top 10 things that I think will work for my child. I hope I get 5 of them. And then in the end, if 3 of them are working out, I've done a good job. You know, I've gotten through at least the first 3 months of school, before I have to go back in and say, hey, this isn't working. No one comes to me and say, hey, this isn't working. They'll call me and go, hey, your son's having a meltdown, why? I don't know, I'm not there. You know, can you come? And I'm like, well, I could, but then the next time that he has a meltdown, he's gonna say, hey, mom's coming. And he's a smart cookie, you know, he's gonna know that. I mean, many a time, I picked him up once and he got home and he's like, okay, it's movie time. And I'm like, oh, it's English time, it's not 3 o'clock yet. We're at home, I'm not at school. I'm like, it's not 3 o'clock yet. So we did English, and that was the last time that he asked for me to be called. So when we look at services and funding for these services, these school districts that their budgets are stretched because we talk about, you know, the average of 16%, I really do think that that's not the average. I mean, I know they were talking the 20% at the charter school, at the one charter school. I imagine that's like the autism spectrum charter school. I think 20% is a little high. But I don't think the average of 16 is probably pertains now any longer. And so when my son gets services, they need to be funded to be effective services. So what you guys are doing is phenomenal. I'm so glad that you are looking into this because I work beyond, I work 40 hours a week. And so when I go into the school district and I've written in my IEP for the year because I'm helping them out, that they can honestly tell me that when they get these services and they're approved these services for our children, that they actually work. And they work because they're well funded. And our teachers get training that they desperately need to have. The assistant teachers are not just paid the $8 an hour that they get. I mean, you know, if you're $8 an hour and you have a kid that melts down, you know, 5 hours out of the 6 hours you have him, that's a tough job. That's a tough job. And so with that special education funding, training, better training for our teachers and the people that help in the classrooms will go a long way. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Let me move it over.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Brown and O'Neill, Ms. Dumaresque, and members. My name is Audrey Rasmussen. I'm a special education parent and a special education attorney. Whenever I listen to the testimony of other parents of special education students, one thing that stands out is that nearly all of them describe having had to struggle to get their school districts to provide what their children need. Now, I have 2 children who receive special education services. When my son Abraham was 2.5, he regressed into an autism so severe that I think of it as something that erased him. His personality, his skills, his happiness were gone. He was not so much changed as absent. Naturally, I cried a great deal about what was happening to my child. But I also cried because I was a lawyer who had spent one law school summer interning with a school solicitor. And I knew this was the end of peace in our lives. Let's consider a parent's relationship with her child's school system. It will last a minimum of 12 years, multiplied by the number of children in the family. Hundreds of people will go in and out of their children's lives during this time. Written and verbal communication will be exchanged more frequently than with any other public or government agency. This is typically the lengthiest and most complicated relationship any of us has with our government. If a parent is not at peace with the local education agency or LEA, there's no peace in that parent's life, nor in his child's, nor frequently in the teaching professionals who wish to help the child. I researched a great deal of special education law the summer I interned with a school solicitor, and the cases I read were a revelation. I learned that LEAs routinely told parents one thing and did another, pretended certain programs existed, piled on administrative proceedings to delay parents being able to litigate until worn out. These parents would agree to far less than their children needed. After all, their children were getting older, they were aging through critical learning periods, and something was better than nothing. Now, that was 21 years ago. Today, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act has corrected many of these administrative and procedural barriers. Special education methods have grown astonishingly more sophisticated and effective over the last 2 decades. Even so, parents continue to report struggles. This tells us something about the distrust that infects too many relationships between LEAs and parents, and about how the difficult, demanding parent becomes the difficult, demanding parent. She's a mother who receives phone calls nearly every day at work, complaining that her child is out of control at school. He's hiring an attorney because after he advocated for his child with his LEA, they began to suspend the child for behaviors that the parent knows the child is unable to control because of his disability. Incidentally, this practice of disciplining children for behaviors caused by their disabilities instead of revisiting their behavioral plans is, in my own experience, one of the most pervasive, commonplace forms of noncompliance by LEAs, and also one of the most destructive and abusive. I'm going to suggest that among all our civil rights laws, the health of the law that is supposed to protect the educational rights of students with disabilities is uniquely poor. When a member of a minority group applies for a job, she doesn't sit down in advance and study the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When a parent goes shopping for books about special education, he'll find far fewer about learning disabilities than he will about special education law. The stated purpose of these books is to educate parents to become better advocates for their children. In what other area of the law do we begin with the assumption that people will not get things that they are legally entitled to without learning to negotiate, to advocate? Hundreds of special education parents have shared their stories with me over the past 16 years. I hear about school districts that don't disclose the existence of some of their programs to parents. I hear about IEP team meetings, I beg your pardon, where parents are told, well, we never do it. We always do it this way. Totally ignoring the fact that IDEIA mandates that every individualized education plan be tailored, individualized, to the needs of that student. Along with improper disciplinary practices, this cookie-cutter approach to special education is the concern I hear about most frequently. Sometimes it results in children being denied the least restrictive environment. In other cases, it results in children being left to flail and fail in the regular education environment without appropriate supports. I assure you that the overwhelming majority of parents of children with disabilities are not demanding and difficult because we are natural helicopter parents. Most of us would give our eye teeth to be allowed to ignore our children's lives just a little bit. We are as we are because we know how often children do not receive a free and appropriate public education. We also know how hard it can be to repair the damage done by a denial of FAPE. When my daughter was an 8-year-old in 2nd grade, her written plan was not followed. She is now 16. 8 years later, we are still working to help her regain the skills she lost because of that denial of FAPE. Now, I also hear stories about LEAs and employees who just struggle to provide appropriate programs for students. Let's face it, they are struggling to follow the law. And we have no business tying the hands of these LEAs any further by imposing upon them a funding formula that impedes their ability to comply with IDEIA. Unrealistic funding leads to poor programs. It leads to law breaking by school districts, and it leads to difficult, demanding, and litigious parents. One step in the right direction would be a funding formula that not only reflects the actual number of special education students being served by an LEA, but the type of services being provided. This better takes into account that some students are high needs and others are lower needs. We don't need data necessarily about the breakdown of the various disabilities, because that information does not always reflect, what the school district is obliged to supply for its students. We need data about things like the actual number of speech therapy hours that go on in school at school expense, about the number of miles driven by dedicated special education motor vehicles every day to transport students to and from school, about the number of one-on-one aides working in the district, and so on. We need to end this money-driven game that pits parents against LEAs by budgeting in a manner that reflects the realities of the things that our LEAs need to do. We're Pennsylvanians, and in many respects, our state has a remarkably good record on providing special education services, and we can be proud of it. Looking to the future, I think that as Pennsylvanians, we can do even better. Better than a 16% fits-all funding solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I think we've learned along this process, and many of us probably knew before we even started down this road with the legislation, is that, in the legislation we're required to create 3 categories and the parameters in there for a funding formula. But the thing that have really learned through this process is that all 3 of your sons could be in the same category, but yet their needs and services are vastly different. Some may need less, some may need more, some may need outside help, so forth. So our goal, and a tough task that it's going to be, is to try to figure out how to create this formula that best fits not only the criteria, but the expanded and differential of needs of a different student. So I thank you for bringing that to our attention. Senator Brown.
I really couldn't say much better. I think we had a panel of parents with their children in my home district in Allentown just a couple weeks ago, and no one has reinforced the importance of the charge of this commission better over our 6 hearings than all of you and that corresponding group in Allentown about the fact that the current formula in its cookie-cutter approach to looking at special education is just inadequate. It's been adequate for a very long time. The challenge is going to be how do we adjust it in such a way that it, as Representative O'Neill had mentioned, that it accounts for all the variations that we see in different student needs. And part of the challenge is that for the same, and maybe you'd like to comment on this, how we, from your perspective, how we take this into account. For the same student, there's no one that's exactly the same, but if you had to structure a program in a school district in one part of the state and the other for the same type of need, one district would put together a program that's very different than another one, or an IU will put together a program very different than another IU across the state that has to be accommodated in a formula the same way, because there's not the exact agreement as to the proper protocols for that type of student. And the cost may be very different. I don't know what, in the end, how we will accommodate that in a formula, but I think that's one of our biggest challenges. How do you get away from an understanding that you can't look at this stuff generically, and there's a lot of variation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we as parents all have different ideas on what would be the best way to go about teaching our children. You know, there are lots of models out there that have been used. One was, so this is probably a completely different kind of commission, but where you have, instead of pulling all these children out into support classrooms, that you put a special education teacher and a regular teacher in a classroom where all these children would be able to learn together. I mean, that is the true meaning of inclusion. I mean, we talk about including, but including isn't sitting a pod full of 4 boys in the back of the room with their aide while the classroom goes on around them. I mean, as far as looking at a budget, if you think about how if the school district would have the funding to hire appropriate educated teachers, I guess is kind of what I'm looking at, whereas special education and regular education teachers, there wouldn't be a need for all of these outlining services that we have now. I mean, I know that's a big, broader picture, but that would be the truth of the matter.
We've been advised to look at best practices in regards to this, and so that the formula and its weights would accommodate that. Not if there's a protocol that's less expensive or more expensive, but it's not considered the best practice, it's probably not a way to build a formula.
Right.
And hopefully from your experience, it's something you would agree with.
And I have to agree with Jane in that there are still issues in school districts regarding least restrictive environment and sending children out of the district for services. And that this isn't always effective. It's certainly not a less expensive way to do things, but to continue to look at that in the school districts, look at that, excuse me, at that data, which is provided on the students' IEPs, and make sure that we are using those best practices in the schools and not having to send the children out because of the cost that's involved, but to have those best practices used in their home schools, in gen ed classes, with supports and services.
I agree with you. However, I will tell you, I have a parent coming to my office right now in my district who's fighting the school district for the complete opposite. They don't want their child brought back.
And if there's ineffective practice, that's going to happen.
Well, it has nothing to do with the practice. They just think that the child is more comfortable being in the setting they've been in, where they're at. They don't want them being brought back because what the school district is trying to do is what you're saying, to bring the students into their home school district to, educate them with their peers and so forth from their neighborhoods. And that parent does not want that.
Well,
so
it does come with.
Yeah, and that
I've
makes it
been
difficult.
there. I know
yeah.
that. I've been there. I've looked at. We have a special education school not far from us, New Horizon, and I've looked at it. I've gone there. I've gone. Would he be happier here? Would he have friends here? He would definitely have children that wouldn't judge him for his quirky noises and sometimes inappropriate fart noises, but he's still an 11-year-old boy that's going to have to function in society with typical peers.
Great. Thank you. Does anybody
Thank
else
you.
have a question? Well, ladies, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for making the journey.
Thank
Your son looks so much like you. Thank you. I want to thank all the members who were able to come to State College today. I want to thank the university and the Nittany Lion Inn for hosting us, and as always, our staff in the back there, Vicki and Judy, for journey home. Our next meeting is tentative right now. We don't, for this, the 19th of September? For the 19th of September, so stay tuned. We'll be announcing where and when and the topic. Thank you very much. Everybody have a safe day.